Warning: this collection contains accounts of disappearance, violence, and distressing themes. Some scenes are unsettling and deal with loss and the long after of trauma. Listener discretion advised. I host these stories because I have spent years collecting them from people who live along the rivers and ridgelines of Oregon. People who thought the trees were safe until the trees told them otherwise. I am not here to prove or to preach. I am only passing along what was said to me, how it sounded in the dark, and what remained when the lights came back on. If you stay with me until the end, consider subscribing and hit the bell so you won't miss another one. If these things matter to you, there are more like them, and we need witnesses. Listen to the first voice I was given. He called himself Mark. He lived on the eastern slope of the Cascades and had worked as a commercial fisherman before moving inland. The story began with a plan, a 3-day loop he was running alone on the Pacific Crest Trail during the late October rains. Headlamp, spare batteries, and a new stove he wanted to field test. He said he loved the solitude. It was the only time his mind settled. The weather report had promised wind and occasional mist. He remembers the smell of wet cedar and the metallic tang of old rain on compacted leaves. On day one, the trail was what it always is. Mud that caught boots mid-arch, a constant undercurrent of water somewhere downslope. He camped near a narrow saddle and fell asleep to the rattle of an aging tent frame. On day two, there was a small thing that he didn't think would matter, an extra set of footprints in the soft mud near his campsite. They were not fresh, they matched nothing his headlamp could find up the path or down. He booted them off as a hiker who had passed earlier, chalked it to late-season traffic. He took the detour toward a small tarn because he wanted fresh water, and that is when the clouds pressed low, the kind of white that drains color out of a world. The tarn was a flat sheet of black with a thin blue sheen on top. He remembered thinking it looked like oil. He heard the whisper before he saw anything. It was a sound not much louder than the rustle of his hood, a human breath made fretful by the cold, and it came from behind the ring of alders around the tarn. He turned and shined his lamp and found nothing but the pattern of his beam on dripping branches. The whisper repeated. This time he could make out the cadence of syllables, a fragment that sounded like his name. He set his pack down hard and moved toward the sound, because that's what you do. You chase what your mind names. There was a shallow depression in the leaf litter, as if someone had sat and then slid away. He would later insist to me that he did not feel danger yet, more a scratching curiosity, like a loose thread he wanted to pull. The escalation was small at first. A handful of small items misplaced, the strap of his stove missing where it should have been, a radio he had left on the log suddenly back in his pack, though he remembered zipping it elsewhere. His phone, he had good service spurts on that ridge, showed one missed call from an unknown number with no voicemail. In the afternoon, a truck engine droned in the distance for a moment and then was gone. There is a highway nearby, but too low and too far for engines to sound that close. He told himself the ridge was playing tricks, that wind and memory mixed in rain can reorder a camp like a child rearranging a room when you sleep. He pressed on because he had to make his mileage and the light was dwindling. The first full confrontation came as a near miss on a slick section of trail where the roots curled like sleeping things. He felt a presence on the dark path behind him, an immediate pressure that took the air from his chest. He turned, headlamp sweeping, nothing. Then a flash of white, too quick for the mind to catch, and the scent of diesel. He heard laughter, not a single laugh, but layered, choked, and distant. It might have been elk, it might have been men at a hunter's camp. He ran, and here the memory becomes jagged for him. He says he does not know how long he ran, how many times his thighs burned and the rain slicked his legs like oil. He remembers the breath in his ears, the slow, steady beat of it that was not his own. He ran until he thought he crawled into a clearing and stumbled into the warm light of a maintenance road and found his pack open on the shoulder. The stove strap was gone. He called the rangers the next morning. Rangers came, polite and thorough, and wrote down the extra prints, and later a tracker identified them as 2 different sets, one human, one not quite matching any known boot print. The case file had a technical phrase, unidentified track morphology. There were no cameras, no other hikers reported for miles, and no signs of forced entry anywhere in the cabins along that stretch. The rangers suggested hypothermic hallucination, or that he had passed another hiker and wasn't awake enough to register them. Mark refused the word hallucination. He said something else came with the diesel smell, the hollow eyes of someone or something in the tree line. He used that phrase, hollow eyes, as if the darkness had found a face and carved the light out of it. He still avoids that saddle in October. He says the whisper has followed him into his dreams and sometimes into the grocery store when he least expects it. When I left his house in Hood River, the wind carved thin fingertip grooves in my jacket, and I heard the motif that would return in other tellings. A voice or a sound in the periphery, a smell that doesn't belong. It is the shape of these stories. If the woods whisper to one, they whisper to all. The next voice was from a woman who gave her name as Elise. She is a park volunteer, and she told me about Silver Falls, but not the postcard falls everyone photographs. Her story happened along a back trail that runs under the heavier trees, where the cliffside keeps a constant, cold shadow, and the mist from the third drop coats your eyelashes with fine beads. She'd been leading a night survey, lamp on hard hat, radio clipped to a shoulder strap, an old thermos of black coffee. She told me she believed in the river, not as a person, but as a thing with memory. That belief came from what she found the first winter she worked there. The setup was a sequence of small, ordinary tasks. Check the railings, post signage, note erosion. She and a colleague saw a set of footprints on the muddy service path that should have been empty. The prints were small, barefoot-shaped, the kind you might make wading at the edge of the ledge. They led toward the cliff edge and then stopped. No other prints nearby. Elise's radio caught only static the whole night, a low hiss that set her teeth on edge. At around midnight, they found a child's jacket hung over a branch, pink, damp, and empty. She said her hands would not stop shaking while they called for search crews. The escalation was the sound. From the base of the falls through the trees came a clear, thin singing. Not a tune that matched any lullaby she knew, but a cadence like counting. Her colleague said it sounded like stones being slid together. The survey team spread out with headlamps and flashlights, and the singing stopped each time a lamp passed over where it seemed to originate. They found no child. They found something else. A circle of stones tucked beneath a mat of moss, as if someone had tried to cover a small pit. There were no footprints inside the circle, only leaf litter that had been smoothed. Elise remembers the light catching on a tooth, white, tiny, that turned out to be a bead from the jacket's zipper caught in the moss. There was no bone, no obvious sign of a body. The coroner later took soil samples. The reports showed no human DNA sufficient to confirm a burial. The case was closed as unresolved missing person, an active file with a name redacted for the family's privacy. After the search, Elise said she began hearing the counting sometimes when she walked alone at night. It would be under the roar of the falls, patient and slow. She would stop and the counting would stop, and then when she resumed, it would begin again, as if to test whether anyone was listening. She started to sleep with the thermos half full on the bedside table, a superstitious talisman. Her supervisor told her compassionately that the forest holds on to people in strange ways. Missing hikers, a child lost long ago. An elder in town told her not to poke at the places where water gathers. Elise told me that the jacket had been returned to a family out of state. They were grateful for the closure of a small thing, but the missing persons file remains open. For herself, she has switched to daytime patrols only. A month later, I received a carefully typed email from a person who said they were a highway trucker and requested anonymity. He told me about an encounter on Highway 101 near a coastal lighthouse that sits on a razor of land battered by winter fog and salt. He called himself Rogers in the email and used precise, functional language. He was not a thrill seeker. He drove the night runs to keep money moving, and because nighttime driving blurred his thoughts into a quiet monotony that paid bills. The setup was simple: a late freight, a storm that made the wipers a metronome, and a call on the CB about a stalled sedan near the lighthouse access road.
He detoured because you pull over for people. It's what truckers do. He found an older sedan pinched into the gravel shoulder, hazard lights blinking like a dying heartbeat. No one was inside. The engine was cold, but the driver's door was open. He walked a careful perimeter with his flashlight. There were no footprints heading inland, only the small, perfectly round impressions of 2 dog paws set just beyond the rear bumper. His intuition said leave, but some muscle memory of duty outweighed it. He reached into the back seat for a jumper cable and then saw on the sand by the access gate a small stack of stones, each one balanced with quiet care. It looked like a child's cairn. He thought of journalistic pieces on coastal folklore, markers left to honor the dead, he told himself. He set the cables down gently and called dispatch. Other rigs arrived. State police found no signs of violence in the car. Clean upholstery, a half-drunk cup of coffee, a pair of sunglasses folded on the dash. Yet out on the inlet, the tide had left behind a web of seaweed and a single child's rubber boot. There were no matching footprints inland. The boot sat where the foam had licked it and then retreated. Video from a nearby surveillance camera showed the car rolling slowly into the shoulder and then an indistinct blur near the top of the frame, an absence with a shimmer around it, then static for 30 seconds. Rogers, pragmatic to the marrow, told me later that he only felt the hairs lift on the back of his neck when the fog pressed close and the radio hissed like white cloth. The coroner's investigators wrote no cause on their first report, pending lab results. The boot would be preserved in evidence, and the case is listed now in public logs as investigation ongoing. Rogers stopped taking the lighthouse runs after that season. When he told the story on the phone, his voice stayed even, but he kept rubbing at the corner of the rim of his mug as if he could smooth the memory away. Another story came from a young couple, June and Tyler, who rented a tiny cabin near Crater Lake for a weekend away from the city. They hoped for quiet and ended with a bruise in their relationship that still hadn't entirely healed.
Their setup is the almost too familiar romantic setup. Firewood, bottled wine, a hiking plan for the rim trail. The weather turned earlier than expected. The sky went from bruised violet to a flat gray that pressed the sound down into their bones. The first oddity was the door. They awoke one morning to find it unlocked and a single footprint on the mud-splattered welcome mat. Tyler blamed himself for leaving it ajar after he took an early morning smoke. June insisted she locked it. They argued briefly and then settled back into each other's arms and the kind of silence that is not entirely comfortable. The escalation was the photograph. Tyler is a hobbyist with an old DSLR. He takes portraits of the trees and the curve of the rim. He showed June the photos that night as they scrolled through. Their faces lit by the stove, the cabin curved in shadow. On the last image, there was a figure standing in the doorway behind them. Not fully formed, but not merely a trick of light. A dark vertical with a thin suggestion of a face. Tyler swore he hadn't seen it while taking the shot. They went back through every file. Metadata showed no edits. They drove to report it at the ranger station the next day. The ranger examined the photograph professionally and said simply it might be a double exposure or light catching a mist. The couple left angry with the dismissal and more uncertain about the memory of the night. They were sensible people. They trusted evidence. The fact that no one could explain it left them sliding toward quieter versions of themselves. Climax came 2 weeks later. June returned alone to pick up some unattended belongings. She arrived at dusk to find the cabin empty, but then felt an instant drop in temperature, like the air had borrowed winter for a spell. The smell of something like old laundry and metal made her step back. Then the whisper, soft and particular, like someone repeating a forgotten line of a song. June said she walked to the doorway and found the welcome mat shoved partway under the sill, as if something had been dragged into the house and then pulled away. She called Tyler, and for the first time in their relationship, pleaded over the phone with a voice she didn't recognize. She left the rest of their possessions with a neighbor and refused to return.
Tyler would later tell me that he dreams of the doorway, and sometimes the figure stands on the edge of the photo like a stain that will not wash out. They have separated now, and both still avoid long stretches of forest in the late season. From these small human misfortunes, we hear larger echoes. A man who works night shifts at the St. John's Bridge maintenance crew wrote to me with a short note. The bridge gulls are loud in spring, but silent in autumn, and that silence carries its own weight. He told me of a night when the lights blinked and the river below turned a color he could not name. He had been sent to inspect a loose bolt on a catwalk, and he took his headlamp down to the river level. The river thrummed with a sound like distant drums. Halfway across the bridge, he found a single, meticulous ring of stones laid out on the catwalk like a child's crown. Around the stones, the paint on the grating had been scraped down in small semicircles, as if something had dragged itself in a slow, ritual rhythm. He called the superintendent. An inspector with a skeptical face came out and photographed the pattern. The superintendent joked that kids had been up there, and then paid the man to take the rest of the night shift. The inspector emailed later, months after, to say that when he returned to the bridge in daylight, the pattern was still there, and the scrape marks had a residue, salt and soil, on a scale that suggested something from the river had climbed into a human place and touched it back. Then there's the story from a woman who drove the back roads to visit an aging parent in a small town near Walla Walla-type Lake. She is a teacher, and her voice is patient. She wrote me about a late-night detour because of a fallen tree. She parked and walked a few hundred yards with her flashlight to see what the blockage was. The rain had left cobwebs across low branches, and the air smelled of wet grass and old tires. In a clearing, she found a patch of earth disturbed and a ring of dark, wet soil. No bones, no visible remains, only an impression like a person had been kneeling there and then been gone. She reported it to the county line sheriff. Deputies took photos and put in a routine service call. The sheriff's log later marked it as possible animal disturbance and closed it pending forensic interest. The woman, however, began to dream of feet that left no prints, of something that walked without bending the grass. She no longer walks at night alone. Not all the accounts ended with an official shrug. There was one that read like a thin, furious dispatch from someone named Mateo, a hiker who was last seen on a trail near an old mining town. He described how, on the first morning of a 5-day loop, his friend woke to find Mateo gone and his sleeping bag zipped neatly but empty. The friend assumed Mateo had gone ahead. A mile up the trail, the friend's headlamp found Mateo's glasses, not broken, placed on a rock as if set down for a minute. The friend screamed Mateo's name until his voice flattened and hoarse. Other hikers were called. They grid searched. A ranger found Mateo's pack, and later a personal item nearby, an old harmonica, lying face up with no footprints close by. Later, when the county issued a formal search, a trooper told the family that the tracks indicated Mateo had sat down, perhaps to rest, and then left in a direction the trooper could not reconcile with the slope or the abrasion on vegetation. It was as if the path had feathered away. The search turned up no remains. Months later, a hunter found a harmonica in the wash near a creek, a matching piece, and turned it in. It added to the thin ledger of evidence but did not return a person. The aftermath for those left behind is a quieter horror. Sleeplessness, the avoidance of the places the missing loved one favored, small shrines and kitchens. The families called me to say that the absence made other tasks oddly loud. A mother replaces a shower curtain, and the new rings sound like a question. An ex-husband takes a different route to work because at the corner where they had last argued, he can imagine the person standing, waiting. One woman told me she keeps the harmonica in a drawer and breathes on it sometimes as if its tune might answer her. There are also reports that skirt the border between criminal and uncanny. A local logger told me of a series of trucks that began appearing on a back logging road after sundown. Old rigs, their tail lights dim, idling like a congregation of moths. Men would stand in the rain and lean into each other and talk in voices low as river pebbles. The logger, who stayed anonymous, said he recognized one of the rigs because he had seen it months before in a county bulletin about a missing person. He tried to take a photograph and his camera failed. No warrantable excuse, simply a file that would not save. The county trooper who came out to speak with him later said the trucks had been observed at odd hours and were being looked into as possible moonshine operations or salvage crews, not necessarily linked to disappearances. The logger said he slept with the radio on after that, and that sometimes he would hear the hum of engines far away and know that something, people or something else, was moving along the old road at night. My own favorite last night story is quieter and older. A woman who runs a small guest house near Timok Forest, call her Margaret, though that is not her real name, recounted waking one autumn to the sound of a man pacing in the gravel outside. She thought it was a guest and went down in her robe, slippers whispering on the porch. The man stood in the fog, wet collar turned up, and when she called, he disappeared in the action of a blink, as if she had merely imagined the silhouette. The next morning, she found in the yard a ring of small stones, carefully placed, and 3 pine cones arranged upright like sentinel candles. She keeps those pine cones in a box and sometimes opens it and breathes the long dust of them. She told me the ring of stones was not a threat. It felt like a message. She had grown up with local stories about people leaving offerings to the lake and the trees in exchange for safe passage. She had never been someone to embrace ritual, but she respects that sometimes we are asked to leave things alone for reasons we cannot name. By the time I finished that round of interviews, a few motifs had braided through the accounts. Footprints that end, a whisper at the edge of hearing, the cold touch that feels like fingers, and a blue mist that settles into low places and refuses to lift. People I spoke with did not claim miracles. They claimed a sense of altered attention. Some used natural explanations: fog, hypothermia, grief. Others left the possibility of something otherwise. The cases that touched law enforcement tended to be treated with the impersonal care of procedure. A trooper's log here, a ranger's note there, soil samples, camera footage with a sudden blank. Authorities sometimes provided plausible alternatives. Sometimes they provided nothing at all. In several files, the phrase "case remains open" returns like a scar. The final story people gave me that season, the one that came with a sense of parody, that is, as unsettling as anything public record can be, was from a man who works nights at a lighthouse on a small coastal spit. He described a late spring storm when the fog rolled inland thick as felt, and the beam of the lighthouse seemed to push against a physical presence. He had been at the lantern room when the radio hissed a single call sign with no person attached. He walked the spiral stairs and found on the gallery a child's shoe, polished clean as glass and wet with salt. No visitor logs recorded anyone at the time. He put the shoe in a towel and carried it downstairs. The shoe belonged to nobody in town. He left it in the evidence box at the station, and that was the nearest thing the county had to a lead. I will not claim that any of these accounts prove a pattern beyond human fear and the habit we have of making meaning when the world refuses coherence. What I do say is this: there is a geography of uncertainty in Oregon that tends to collect certain kinds of people: lone hikers, lovers, truckers, volunteers, and likewise certain kinds of absences. If you spend enough years listening, the absent places begin to speak with tiny voices, and you remember how brittle a life can be when the ground itself seems to rearrange. If you have followed across these stories and one scratches at something you know, leave a note below when you can. There are resources linked in the description if any detail here touches on a real and urgent wrong. If you or someone you love is missing, contacting local authorities is the right course, and I will include support lines and reporting tips in the show notes for anyone who needs them. For now, let me leave you with what so many of the narrators said at the end of a long telling. Respect the quiet. Do not go where the map looks empty, and remember that the land keeps records we cannot read. There are more voices I gathered that do not rest easily. One woman sent me a recording, file name breath03.wave, and said, Listen to the wind.
She grew up by a small, shallow lake that people in town call Mirror Hollow, because on perfect days the surface lays flat as glass and spits back trees and sky. She had gone out after a late October windstorm to check traps for beavers. The traps were intact. The air smelled like iron and old leaves. Her flashlight made the surface flare with oil-slick stars. She said she heard a splash and then, faint and close, the sound of someone exhaling as if from directly beneath the water. She called the county and waited at the edge. They found no disturbance in the water beyond the ring of the splash and a smear of disturbed reeds that suggested a small animal had broken free. She later found, folded like a note beneath a rock by the pier, a child's mitten. No child was ever reported missing in the county that matched the possible age. She keeps the mitten in a dresser drawer and sometimes wakes with the smell of the lake under her nose. I could go on with the other voices, each carrying details that make the skin tighten. A hitchhiker who left a journal in a Motel 6 citing a man with hollow eyes who followed him down an industrial corridor. An urban explorer who entered an abandoned hotel near an old mill and found rooms staged for dinner with chairs turned inward. A patrolman who watched a pattern of headlights on an old logging route time and again. Lights that began to move slower as if unwilling to leave the fog. All of them fold back into the same uneasy geometry. Places where light and sound are distorted, where footprints end without a seam, where objects do not belong and yet are placed with careful hands. When we leave, ask yourself, not whether these were ghosts or criminals or misread nature, but whether you would like to be the kind of person who goes alone into a place where something has already been lost. The people who told me their stories were not reckless. They were ordinary, and what happened to them suggests that ordinary people can find themselves subject to extraordinary absences. I will gather more of these voices, more whispers from ridges and rain-slick roads, more small things left on thresholds and in the pockets of jackets. For now, I want you to carry one image away, the blue mist that settles into a hollow and refuses to lift, a color like a bruise the size of a valley. Hold it and remember the quiet. If this unsettled you, consider subscribing and sharing. These stories are easier to bear when we remember them together. If anything here echoes a real danger or a missing person you know, please reach out to local law enforcement. There are links and resources in the description for reporting and for victim support. It is not over. People keep telling me more, and I keep listening. The next envelope arrived in a padded manila with no return address. Inside, a burned CD, a page torn from a child's composition notebook, crayon flower across the margin, and a note, typed, 2 lines. Listen. You were right about the sound. The sender signed only with a first name I recognized from another voice. June, the woman who kept the mitten in her drawer. I called the number she had given me and asked if she'd mailed the disc. She said she had. She said she had found something she couldn't keep to herself. The CD held one file, labeled breath04.wave. The recording begins with the low, steady hiss of wind and the small, close clamor of a flashlight sliding over wood. There is the measured slap of wet boots on planks, a voice, June's, soft, almost a whisper. Mirror Hollow, she says. I thought I heard it again. At 0:16, the microphone catches a splash. At 0:19, something else. Not a voice in words, but an inhalation that is too long to be a human gasp, too smooth to be wind. It is the sound I had heard in other files, the same inhales that latch to the edges of water, like someone practicing breath against the surface. The microphone skitters. June mutters a prayer. Then a smaller sound, childlike laughter, that breaks off as if cut by a blade. The recording ends with the echo of the wind moving through reeds. I replayed it until the pattern shifted from content to rhythm. After 8 plays, the edges of the sound sharpened, and I could hear, beneath the inhalation, a frequency, thin and high, that the ear treats like a suggestion of a melody. My mind supplied the rest. So do other listeners. We are excellent at translating fragments into whole narratives. I sent June $30 for postage and a message that she could call whenever she wanted to talk. She called that night. She had lived all her life within walking distance of Mira Hollow. The lake, she told me, had been a place for summer picnics and teenage dares. My father taught me to read the weather off the water, she said. He'd say, when the lake holds its face, it keeps what it knows. That phrase, keeps what it knows, is the kind of sentence that gathers the rest of a person's history around it. June's father is dead, so are many things she loved. She did not want to frame the hollow as supernatural exactly. She wanted it treated like a place with an active memory, a place that performed omissions as much as presences. The mitten, she said, voice steady now, wasn't like the rest of the things I find. It's clean, you know, as if someone set it down because they didn't want to soil it with what was already there. She had left the mitten on display, she told me, on a hook in the kitchen where sunlight could touch it. Sometimes, on mornings when the mist was thick and the house smelled like the lake, she swore the mitten smelled faintly of cold water and rot. She couldn't explain that, but she could tell me the moment in which she had picked it up beneath the rock. I was there a long time, she said. People come to Mira Hollow to think about someone gone. We talk to the water like it's our ledger. That day, I was whispering my list, names, things my mother used to say, and then I heard the splash and the breathing. I waited and waited. Nothing came until I saw the mitten. I kept thinking, how can something so ordinary fit into a place that's already full of absence? June's voice had the tiredness of someone who had been hearing too much of whatever that hollow contained. When I asked whether she'd reported the mitten, she said she had not. Who do you tell, she asked, that a mitten fell on the bank like a punctuation mark? They might station deputies there if I said so. They might make me feel foolish, so I kept it. We talked about other things. The night drivers who've slowed on Old County Road 7, the man who once left his dog by the pier and came back with his hair wet to the shoulders and no memory of being away. June's mother had been one of those people who, when something in town didn't fit, called it old country thinking and tried to smooth it. My mother's way, June said, was to put a casserole on the table and say, "Forget it, child." But some things don't get forgotten by casserole. June sent me photographs too. A child's mitten on sun-bleached planks, the hollow at dawn, and, once, a close shot of the lake surface that looks like nothing, a smear of gray with a ring of light in the middle, except that if you look too long, you think you can see your own face, until you realize it is the tree line inverted. The next days yielded other messages. A retired state trooper named Ricardo emailed me a terse note. He had been on patrol in the late 90s when he was flagged down by a lumberman who said his partner had walked into the woods and not returned. They had searched until sunrise and found only the partner's hat snagged on a branch and a trail of footsteps that stopped cleanly at the base of a slope, as if somebody had been folded into the earth. Ricardo took this as a call of duty. He sent me his report, no finding, just a box checked, and later in our conversation he offered a different kind of admission. There are roads you don't travel at night, he said. Not because of who you'll meet, but because you can feel the land watching. I've felt that on more than one ridge. You don't make that up after a career. You only start to notice it. He had an old map he kept in his garage under a rubber band, a map with pencil marks from every call he'd ever taken. He found a circle of smudged marks for Mira Hollow, and showed me a line that stops 15 feet short of the water, as if the logging skidder had been pulled away from some invisible boundary. We called it a bad place once, he told me. We didn't mean it to sound mystical. We meant it the way a mechanic says a part is bad. We stopped going in without 2 other men. It wasn't bravery, it was caution. From these reports, the pattern repeats. Places that resist routine, where a group decides between curiosity and caution and often chooses to leave the question asked. The people who study these resistances, paranormal investigators,
folklorists, field biologists, each apply their frame. One sees misinterpreted animal behavior. Another sees a cultural mirror where grief takes form. I do not dismiss any of these. I catalog them. I put them beside one another like specimens on a shelf and look for common tissue. Common tissue. The clinical precision of an absence. Footprints that end. Recorded sound that carries a breath as if it were anchored to a place rather than a throat. Objects left in liminal positions. Chairs turned inward. A mitten folded under a rock. A towel neatly over a banister. Common tissue. The local decision to speak of these places in elliptical, half-laughed terms. Common tissue. The taste of metal in people's mouths when they recount these moments as if memory itself were coded. I spent a week at Mirror Hollow. I wanted to see the place when it conformed to every other photograph I'd been given. A shallow basin of still water rimmed in alder and willow. A dock with 2 boards missing. Cattails that had bent under the first autumn storm. It was quieter than the audio suggested. Even the wind felt like it was measuring itself before speaking. I walked the perimeter at dusk because those hours compress detail into an edge. Shapes become sharp. The air smelled like iron and leaf rot, and I remembered June's words about her father's weather reading. At the pier, I found the rock where she said the mitten had been folded. Something, had placed a small pile of stones upon it. They were arranged in a line, 3 by 3, like a crude child's tic-tac-toe. Not all human places stage their objects in human geometry. This did. I knelt and ran a finger along the stones. They were cool and slightly damp. The wood of the dock creaked with the motion of small creatures. A frog leaped and hit the surface with a neat ring that spidered outward. I had brought a small recorder, a digital unit with a windscreen, and set it on the pier aimed at the water. I held my breath in intervals, not to coax a sound, but to see which of us the hollow wanted to claim. The minutes passed without anything but the low, constant conversation of insect and ripple. I tried to be scientific about the waiting, but the heart will insist on its metaphors. The hollow was like an unread ledger, patient. When I walked back along the brambles, I noticed pairs of footprints overlaying each other. A boot print, then a child's shoe, then the boot again the next step. The pattern suggested someone walking back and forth. Stop, step, stop. Exactly the way a person might stand and think. I traced them to a patch of flattened grass near the tree line. There lay a small thing. A plastic hair clip painted with a cartoon crown, faded to a sickly white. I picked it up. At home, I photographed the clip and sent the images to 3 databases of missing children's items. Nothing matched. The clip's make was common, sold in supermarket racks across decades. It could have been dropped by any number of children. It could also, as with the mitten, be the kind of ordinary object that, when returned to a specific place, begins to argue for its belonging. There are people who make a living staking claims in these borderlands. One night, over coffee with a woman named Harriet who runs a volunteer search organization, I asked what they had learned about places that behave strangely. Harriet had an easy, practical logic. People go missing for reasons that are human, she said. They get lost, they run, they hide, they fall, they are taken. But then there are places where the reason becomes the place. If you stand on a mapped feature and people have gone quiet there, you mark it. You tell your teams. You watch patterns. You don't allow a single human story to settle into a superstition that prevents you from searching. She told me a story that felt like a crosswind running through the others. A trio of college kids who had been driving home and seen headlights slow on an old logging trail. The driver stopped to see if there was a stalled car. They found nothing but a tire track running into ferns, and then a circle of crushed plants like the imprint of a foot from some heavy boot. They waited in the car until dawn and then left, shaken, without notifying police. People call it fear, Harriet said. I call it a decision. You decide if you keep yourself untied to the world that night. There is a formal language that departments use when they cannot account for an absence. It's meant to be clinical, end of trail, or remains not found. But in conversation, in headlights over slick roads, language frays into the old human words: uncanny, hollow, holding. That slippage interests me, where the bureaucratic cool of a report meets the human need to narrate. Both are true. They are simply different kinds of truth. I don't present these stories as an argument for one explanation over another. I present them as evidence that a certain kind of geography in this region, hollows, abandoned mills, slow-moving stretches of river, is a node for a particular human tendency, to find meaning in the space left by a missing thing. We are pattern makers. We are story-hungry. The land, if it can be said to keep records, keeps them in a different currency, a silence that repeats like a motif. The question that keeps nudging me forward is not what the hollow is, but what it does to those who come to it, already carrying absence. People bring their hunger, their grief, their secret departures. They set down objects as if to barter. Here, take this, replace it with an answer. Sometimes, it seems, the land accepts the exchange with strange precision. Other times, it refuses. On my second morning at Mira Hollow, I found a small cassette recorder half buried in the mud at the waterline. Its case was water-warped. The label had been peeled away. When I pried it open, I found a tape threaded through, the kind of cheap consumer tape you buy in stores. The battery compartment was corroded, but still offered juice enough for a moment. I took it to my car and, with some habit born of field work, set it to play. The tape began with a child's voice counting: 1, 2, 3. The counting blurred into the hush of someone breathing. The breath sounded like the recordings I had collected from others. Then a woman's voice: "If you go in, you must come back the same way." The voice was not commanding. It was instructive, like advice given at a kitchen table. The tape jumps, static, and then a fragment. "Left a mitten." The child's voice returns, now closer and oddly formal. "We will come when the hollow sleeps." I listened and then listened again, slower the second time, as if that could coax context from the fragments. The tape did not reveal a secret, but a pattern: admonition, ceremonial cadence, and unresolved pronouncement. The hollow does not speak in sentences so much as in imperatives and repeated gestures. Who made the tape? I do not know. Is the commanding voice human or a memory of one? I do not know. I can only report the fact of the tape, the fact of the mitten, the fact of the rock with stones laid like a game. Each object is a small magnet for meaning. That afternoon, as rain began to lace the sky, I walked the way the locals sometimes do. No route, simply following paths that crisscross the hollow like an informal web. There is a kind of map you make with your feet, a margin of hints indicated by how the moss grows on the north side of stumps, the way the deer trail veers toward old fencing. On one of those trails, I met a man sitting on a log with a thermos and a cigarette stubbed out beside him. He introduced himself as Glenn. He said he used to work at the mill 20 years ago, and that he often comes to the hollow to feed birds. "Don't feed the birds," he said, with a grin that was more tired than mischievous. "They don't need your charity." He laughed, but his eyes did not. We talked about ordinary things: the mill's closure, the lost seasons, the cost of gasoline. Then he became quieter. He told me of a boy who had vanished in winter, when the lake froze and then thawed, and how the mother went to the hollow every day for months. She would stand on the dock and whisper the boy's name, as if it were a call across an expanse. The hollow accepted the whisper, the way a dark vessel accepts coins. At the edge of their conversation, Glenn told me something else. "There's a place farther in," he said, pointing with a nod. "Not far by distance, but there's a curve in the trees where you can feel the light change. People don't go there. They leave their stories at the edge." "Why not?" I asked. "Because some things you don't want to be the first to have to explain." He looked at me as if I might be that kind of person. I was not sure what kind of person I am in that regard,
only that curiosity had earned me a place at the table of these stories. I had no interest in being the first to explain. I had interest in gathering the threads. On my last night in town, I sat at a diner counter with coffee cooling. A woman I had interviewed earlier, Lydia, walked in. She had been a school teacher for 30 years, and her hands still held the grace of someone used to turning pages. We spoke about children and small kindnesses, those gestures that bind a town. Then she asked me a question that reframed everything. "Do you think places are jealous?" she asked. "Jealous?" I repeated. "Yes," she said. "Jealous for what they once were, for the people who used them. Places miss things too, in their way. I think that's what people mean when they say the land keeps records. It's not that the land is keeping our secrets from us. It's that the land remembers what we've taken from it." Her voice softened. "Look, I don't know if that means anything practical, but when something goes quiet in a place, you can feel the absence gather like dust. It settles on things. You can either sweep it, or you can live with the dust. My mother used to say, 'Sweep carefully. Don't throw the baby out with the scrub water.'" I did not leave Mirror Hollow with a solution. I left with a thickening of questions, and with objects, photographs, recordings, a plastic hair clip that refuse simple explanation. What I took back to my desk were the small, stubborn consistencies, the breath beneath water, the objects placed as if in ritual, the ring of missing footsteps that end at the periphery of ordinary maps. Each anecdote accrues like lichen on stone. Each added voice changes the hue of the whole. Back in the city, I played the newly acquired recordings for a friend who is an acoustic analyst. She ran spectrograms and frequency analyses and told me, kindly and professionally, that some of the sounds had harmonics that could be explained by wind interacting with reeds and by small fish breaking surface tension. "But," she said, "there's a modulation in the inhalations, an overtone that looks synthetic." She frowned. "That doesn't mean it's not real. It means there's something else in the mix." There is a danger in technical explanation. It flattens narrative into data and forgets that humans do not encounter only waves and numbers. We encounter suggestion, metaphor, the promptings of memory. Our histories are made of small intolerances, things that will not be folded neatly into a file. A week later, I received one more packet. This one contained a single Polaroid photograph and a note in blunt handwriting. "You asked for more voices. Listen to this one at the end." The Polaroid shows a pier at twilight. On the pier, a single mitten rests on the broken rail. At the horizon, the water seems to hold the sky like a spilled mirror. I put the photograph on my desk. It looked like a punctuation mark, a hard stop placed gently in the middle of a paragraph no longer being written. I cued the recording the accompanying note referenced. Before it, the sender had written, "When you listen, understand I did not play it for the lake. I played it for myself. I need to know if I'm listening alone." The file begins with the sound of a radio being tuned. Static, a ghost of a country station, then a clear tone like an answering bell. Then breathing, longer than before, repetitive. It is close, too close. It is measured, as if the breath is being practiced to a rhythm. Then, in a voice that is both childlike and older than the body that holds it, something speaks a single word: home. The way the recording makes that single syllable into an event is what unsettles me most. It is not declarative. It is a beckon and a location. It is a claim that both includes and excludes. Who speaks it? To whom? Toward what definition of home? I have no authority to answer that. I have only the duty to keep listening, and to keep collecting what others bring me: mittens, cassettes, thin notes, small artifacts, until some pattern either resolves or refuses to be resolved. The region is patient, so are the people who live there. They gather stories like blankets against a cold they do not wish to name. If you have a story with its own small objects, if you have seen footprints end without seam, if you have found a child's mittens set like punctuation beneath a rock, leave a note when you can. There are resources for those who need them in the show notes. But for those who are simply like me, collectors of the small absences, bring your recordings, your photographs, your maps. Bring them with the ordinary caution of someone handling fragile things. Tonight, I will listen again to that voice saying home. I will play it slow, then faster, parsing it for harmonics and for heartbeats that cannot be reduced to waveforms. I will try to imagine the curve of the pier at dusk, the weight of a mitten left in a place that keeps records we cannot read. I will try to hold the image of the blue mist that settles and refuses to lift, and I will try, perhaps foolishly, to keep my curiosity from becoming the very thing that anchors absence to yet another human hope. Because the hollow takes what we give it and returns its own version of our gift. Before I go to bed, I set the Polaroid beside my lamp. The mitten on the rail looks almost luminous in the lamplight, and for a moment I have the odd sensation of being watched, not by a person, but by a place that remembers. I will keep listening.